learning. And yes, so thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very glad I could talk about this topic, second language learning, second language acquisition. I think, as we mentioned a bit before, we're all concerned with second language, right? L2. So I will speak of L2 more generally speaking for second language. And I think it's a topic that really interests most of us because we're, as linguists, scholars, working abroad in, we all speak a second language to a certain extent. So I think it's always interesting to think about the processes related to this, to second language learning. And while it will not be an extensive talk about SLA, so second language acquisition, the goal is really to look at gestures and multimodal communication because it is a growing field of research, but it is still underexplored, I think, at a larger scale. So the idea is I will walk you through some phenomena related to second language acquisition and their visual gestural counterparts, and just to see and argue in favor of a multimodal view of language learning. And since this is kind of a new topic, I'm guessing for most of you, I will also give you some like definitions of what is a gesture, how to analyze them before showing some of these examples. Okay, so I actually like to start with an example because I think it's so much straightforward and it just everything becomes clearer. So I will show a series of videos today from several corpora. So this corpus is a corpus collected by colleagues from Sorbonne Nouvelle University in Paris, and it involves exchanges between L1 and L2 speakers, French and English-speaking speakers from the US, from the UK, from Ireland, etc. And so they are in a tandem setting, so meaning that they are alternating between speaking their L1 and speaking their L2. So the example I'm about to show you is an exchange in English where the girl on the left here is French and the boy on the right is American. So this is his L1, but it's her L2. And as you will see later on, I will show another excerpt from the same pair, but exchanging in French, where the roles are reversed. So he will become the second language speaker and she will be the first language speaker. And so just an example here about what happens when you interact in a second language, not just with your voice, but with your body. And so here she's describing somewhere where some of her relatives have a house and she's talking about hills, but she doesn't really know the word for that. And she offers one specific word that she mispronounces. And so the interlocutor doesn't really understand, but then they get to some sort of form of understanding. So I'll play the clip now. And please let me know if the sound doesn't work, just to make sure. But it should be working though. Okay.
On meadow,
Yeah.
but a big meadow. So when you're
meadow?
Okay. Sort of meadow,
Okay.
not a mountain, but between meadow and mountains.
Okay. Yeah.
And
like big hills.
Yeah, big hills.
Okay.
Right. So the sound worked well, right? Okay. The reason you have this weird quality of the video was because they are anonymized. So I kind of edited the video for that reason. So if you look at the transcription, you see so L2 stands for the L2 speaker, L1 stands for the L1 speaker. And so she's looking for a word, right? She says it on line 2. What's the word? And she says meadow, but actually she means meadow. So you see it starts with a mispronunciation, an issue with the vowel, right? The vowel from the first syllable that is mispronounced in that case, resulting in a communication breakdown on the part of the L1 speaker who repeats the word meadow, so kind of giving a correction, but not sure to understand what she means by meadow. And there she elaborates, and yeah, it says like 6 and 9, sorry. Yeah, a sort of meadow, not a mountain, but a little between meadow and mountains. During that time, I think he starts to understand and so offers kind of feedback tokens. So the tokens of engagement and understanding, okay, then repeated afterwards, right? Okay, yeah. And then that's when he offers what we call corrective feedback, which is an alternative version of the initial word that she offered, which was meadow, and says like big hills, asking a question like, is that what you mean, big hills? And then she repeats, yes, yeah, big hills. So that's the uptake from the L2 speaker. So you see how it plays out, and that happens quite a lot in L1, L2 interactions. You may not have the right word in your first language, so you offer maybe an incorrect word or with a mispronunciation, which is not necessarily understood. But then with some of these strategies, you get to mutual understanding. So that's from a strict verbal and vocal point of view. But actually, if you've noticed by looking at the video, we have a series of gestures, and the gestures truly relate to the concept that she's trying to explain, meaning the kind of hills, right? It's not really a mountain, but it's a bit smaller than a mountain. And you see how her gestures change. She goes from doing this large gesture to refer to this mountain-like thing, but it's actually no, it's smaller than a mountain. So she expresses that as well with her hands. And so and then when he gets to common understanding, he also repeats this kind of hill-like gesture, right, that represents the hills, saying like big hills, and yes, the gesture is repeated afterwards by the L2 speaker. And so you see how you have this extensive use of gestures throughout this exchange to support mutual understanding. And that's something that's going to be the main topic of this talk, is the use of gestures among other articulators. But for now, let's start with gestures. And so the word gesture seemed very broad at first, but there's actually one. I mean, there are several definitions, but so the topic of gestures belong to the theoretical fields of gesture studies and multimodality, which is a growing field of study. Gesture studies has been on for 20 years now, and we have international conferences every 2 years. And now there are even, so what we call the ISGS, the International Society for Gesture Studies. And we also have hubs in different countries, in Italy, in France, in Spain. So it really is growing. And so one simple definition of a gesture is a communicative movement of the hand with recurrent expressive features. That's one basic definition. It's not just a mere movement. It's not a movement to perform an action or an activity. It is a movement that is communicative with some sort of with a degree of expressiveness. And they tend to have recurrent features as well, but I'll get back to that. Another close notion is the fact that these gestures, we produce them a lot, but they're not just random gesticulations that happen to be produced. Actually, gestures have a really tight relationship with speech. And so we think of speech and gesture not as separate processes, with speech on the one hand and gesture on the other, right? As if they had no connection to each other whatsoever. They really are connected. And so we in this view, we consider language to be multimodal. And I'll get back to a definition of multimodality in a second, because again, multimodality may mean different things, but so I'll make it clearer in a minute. Before that, just a bit of history on how, and that's a very simplification what I'm about to say, but it's just to give you some context on how we started working on gestures and multimodality. It actually started out roughly in the 1960s with people interested in conversation. So not experiments, not monologues, but actual real life conversations, naturally occurring speech of people on the phone or in the street talking to each other. And that's conversation analysis, or CA. And so that's kind of the first people who started working not on individual speech, but on conversations. And when you start working on conversations, whether it's even on the phone, I mean, even on the phone, you produce gestures. And when you walk in the street or you talk to someone, you always produce gestures. And so back then they were a bit restricted because they only had audio files. But then later on in the 1970s, with the development of video recording methods and the use of cameras, some scholars from UCLA, Chuck and Marjorie Goodwin, although there were others as well, but I'm just mentioning them because they're kind of prominent figures in this area. So who are anthropologists as well, really wanted to look not only at conversations, but embodied conversations. Because when you produce talk, you produce embodied form of communication because you use your whole body. And so that's when they started looking as well at transcription, because how do you transcribe speech when it's not just speech, when you also have bodily features? And so that's kind of the birth of gesture studies that I mentioned, and also this idea of multimodality. And so the definition of multimodality is kind of a simple one. Here, multimodality refers to the modalities of discourse or the communication channels. And so traditionally, we've been looking at verbal modalities of discourse, especially for people working on written speech, that's strictly verbal. And then, well, for phoneticians and linguists, generally speaking, it's more verbal and vocal, right, with intonation or phonetic particles and all of these elements are not just speech, but that are, well, vocal elements. And then when you look at this full picture, the full picture, you introduce visual gestural features of speech. And that's what happens typically in face-to-face interaction. So that's what we mean by multimodalities, is the integration of the different modalities, verbal, vocal, they go together, verbal, vocal, depend, especially if you work on speech, on audio speech, then it is verbal, vocal, and then visual gestural, and they're all connected. You know already a lot about verbal and vocal modalities, so I'll just skip and talk about the visual gestural modality because I mentioned hand gestures, but it's also facial expressions. So raised eyebrows, they're really meaningful, or frowning or smiling, and it's not just emotions. When you think of raised eyebrows are also produced in information structures. So for information focus, so for emphasis, smiling is not just an emotion, it can also be used for listening. And so there's all of these elements that can actually function as linguistic elements, not just emotional ones. Body orientation, so whether you're oriented to the side or toward your interlocutor. Head movements, so head tilts, head nods. Again, head movements are very frequent in conversation and they serve a variety of functions. Gaze direction as well, and manual gestures. So I'll be talking mostly about hand gestures today, but just so you know, when we speak of the visual gestural modality, we mention all of these articulators, because they're all body articulators. So now, about the gestures and the manual gestures. It's kind of a daunting task when you think of the hands, because they move a lot, and we produce so many of them. So one question you may ask yourselves is how to classify gestures. How do I analyze? As a linguist, I need to classify things. I need to put things in boxes, right? I need labels. I need a label and several values, but that's what we need. And how do you do that with gestures? Well, there's two ways you can do it. You can look, just like in speech, actually, you can look at the form, so the hand shape, orientation, and movement, or you can look at the function of this gesture in discourse and in interaction. So I'll just walk you through some examples that we could provide for the form, for example. So when you think of formal parameters of gestures, there's hand shape, movement, orientation, among others. Of course, I'm just simplifying here so that it makes sense to you. And so hand shape, and so here it really is the shape of the hand. So how many fingers are used in what shape? And so you see these are examples of hand shapes, for example. They're also used in sign language. So you see in signs and gestures are not exactly the same, but we do use some of the same parameters when it comes to form. And so you see, then when you have these recurrent features, you give them names. So these are names for signs. But so, for example, the first one is called baby or hand, with the index finger and thumb, they're curved and touch. The C hand, where the fingers are together and curved. The curved hand with the palm up, but in a kind of a curved position, in a curved way. Or the O hand, with the fingers together, curved, and they touch. And pointing hand, very recurrent one. The index finger is extended from a closed hand. So these are some ways you can analyze gestures. It is a very tedious task because while these may be kind of recurrent features, we also produce very spontaneous gestures that look nothing like this. So it really is a big task of describing what you have. So it's possible, but it just takes a lot of time. That's for hand shape. And then movement. Because you see, if you compare these two gifts, for example, it is the same hand shape. You see the pointing hand, but it's a different movement. On the one hand, you have a cyclic movement with the rotation of the wrists. On the other hand, you have an up and down movement with also rotation of the wrist, but not the same movement. And that really has an effect on the meaning, right? While the first one could be something related to cyclicity, the other one, I think, is very clear from the GIF that it's about scrolling down your phone. So you see same hand shape, different movement, hence different meaning. And then orientation as well. So if you take this example from a talk show and you look at the hand right here and there, the only difference is, well, left and right, of course, but also in terms of orientation. So the first one is oriented towards the interlocutor, right, the host, while the other one is clearly oriented to the side, probably the audience there that is present during the talk show. So again, orientation can really matter, especially in a conversation where you may address or not address the interlocutor, and you may do so with a specific orientation. So yes, that was very quickly some of the formal parameters of gestures you can find. And so, right, hand shape, so the configuration of the hands and fingers, movement of the hands, fingers and wrist, orientation and placement of the hands in space as well. I haven't mentioned pace, because that's also something you may look at, how fast or how quick or how slow a gesture is. That's another parameter. When we think of big gestures and small gestures, it's how much space they take in a gesture space. And so these are other elements that you can look at. And so based on these different formal parameters, some scholars have identified recurrent gesture forms. So this is known as the ring gesture, which can be produced with two hands or one hand. This is also a very famous gesture, the palm up open hand, with one palm or two palms extended, especially and usually accompanied by a shoulder shrug. And then this is also called the palm away open hand, or the cyclic gesture that we saw before. And so these are some ways you can analyze gestures based on their forms, and you can also map sort of relationship between form and function. That leads us to the function. And that is difficult because that really relies on interpretation of the context, on everything. And so I'm gonna give, because there are lots of classifications, existing classifications. I'm just gonna choose some of them and just to present some sort of clear idea, but there are other labels. Usually gestures can be categorized into two main classes, and I'll show you an example so that it will appear, it will be much clearer. So this is an interview with the film director Wes Anderson, and he produces lots of gestures, but we'll focus on two more specifically, and you will understand how the gestures are different from a functional point of view, from the way they relate to speech.
As you go through all these different aspects of this era and this culture, this broad culture, it's a very rich art period.
Right, so there are many gestures, but let's focus on these two. So you see, that's the one gesture he produces. The first one is this one. So
this culture, this broad culture.
Right, this culture, this broad culture. Compare now with the other one. Sorry.
Rich art period.
So you see, in terms of hand shapes, it's kind of similar. I mean, there are differences in movement, but what's really important is the relation to speech. Because you see, on the one hand, he says broad culture. And you may notice that when he said broad culture, he went from his hands being close to each other and moving further apart to kind of illustrate this notion of broadness, right? From a metaphorical perspective, but still, the hands represent the concept of being broad. So you see there's a relationship between speech content, broad, and a gesture that illustrates, though metaphorically, but it still illustrates this notion of broadness. And on the other hand, when he says rich art period, the hands are produced in kind of these botonic movement, up and down movement, like rich art period. But you see, they don't relate to speech because there's no way in these hands represent rich or art or period. What they do is that they're rhythmically associated with speech, especially with each syllable, right? Rich, art, and then period with the first syllable that is stressed in the word period, and it's also where the gesture is produced. So you see, on the one hand, you have the gesture that is used to represent, metaphorically, the adjective broad. So there's a sort of iconic property of the hand represents the notion, while on the other hand, it doesn't represent speech, but it rather emphasizes or punctuate parts of speech. It's linked to discourse itself, but not to the content of discourse. And so one figure, let's say in gesture studies, well, Adam Kendon, also known as the father of gesture, who's done extensive work on gestures. He initially distinguished between two main classes of gestures based on their function and based on the examples I gave you. And so the first type of gesture is gestures related to the content of discourse, to what is being talked about. So there really is a strong relationship between content, speech content, and gesture, or no speech, because sometimes speech is missing, but so you would express this content with the gesture. And this is called referential gestures because they relate to the referent, right? They have referential content. The other types of gestures, the which are period, they don't relate to content, but to discourse itself, to what is happening in the discourse, in the interaction. So they're more like meta, right? Pragmatic or discursive. And they're called pragmatic gestures because they're not about content, but they're about speech and all those speech processes and discourse processes. So these are two main classes of gestures. Scholars in gesture studies have used it a lot. Others criticize it. I mean, there are, again, lots of classifications. I'm just giving you one example among others. And then you can also classify these types into subtypes, which is what I've done based on lots of different categories. So you see among the referential gestures, you can have representational. So the broad culture was representational because it represents a notion, an object, right? You can take a ball and you represent the shape of a ball, or you can mimic someone walking and you mimic the action of walking. So that's representational because you use means of representation. And then deictic, well, just like in speech, you use it to point towards a referent, to place a referent in space or to point towards it. That's deictic. Both referential, but in different ways. And then with the pragmatic gestures, you have the discursive gestures, so that really relate to discourse processes, emphasis, contrast, prosody, etc., while interactive gestures really relate to to the interactional dimension of discourse. So giving the turn, referring to what the other person is saying. So these gestures are really oriented towards the interlocutor. They're used for the interlocutor. And then thinking. That one is a good one, especially for L2. So the example I gave here is not really visible here, is a finger snap. And so you see when you snap your finger like this in speech, you may do this when you're thinking about a word, like, oh, what's the word for this? Or you may tap against a table, or you may move your hands like this and or do a cyclic gestures when you're trying to think about the word or you're thinking about the name you forgot. So they're called thinking gestures because they kind of embody this process of thinking. So these are some of the subtypes. Now let's look at more examples. Other examples in L2 data. So this is from an entirely different corpus. So it's not tandem interactions anymore. These are interactions between Finnish learners of English. So this is from a project on Fluency. And so in here we have task-based interactions where the participants are asked to think that they are in some sort of scenario where they're stranded on this desert island, and they have a list of items. So you may see that on the table there's a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper is a map with different objects. So binoculars or a tent or a flashlight, and they have to think about these objects and rank them in terms of how useful they are if you end up in an island. And so that's why we call this task-based interactions, because the interaction really revolves around the task, around the goal in achieving the task, which is how do we rank these items from most useful to the least useful. And so in these examples, we also find some gestures there. So I'll just show you. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry the sound quality is really bad on the first one. I'll play it again, but you can also use the subtitles to help. Right, that's one example. Another one.
Radio. Then we get to the useless stuff. Yeah. Oh, actually, the medpack.
Yeah.
Right, and then I'll play it again because they're short.
Radio. Then we get to the useless stuff. Yeah. Oh, actually, the medpack.
Yeah.
And then third.
Doing the kettle pot.
Okay.
Doing the kettle pot.
Okay, so you may have your guesses already, but so if you look at these, each time the gesture that I showed serves a different function. So the first one, for example, you see she's looking for the word binoculars, and you see before she does that, she does this representational gesture to refer right to the binoculars and the shape of the binoculars and also the action associated with using binoculars. Because they're not just glasses. I mean, they have this round shape, but they're also used, usually you kind of turn them in a certain way to look from a distance. And so you see it's both the shape, but also the movement associated with the binoculars. And so you see that's definitely a representational gesture, so a referential gesture. Then the other one is also referential, but this time he's pointing, well, not pointing with his index finger, but with his whole palm towards a referent on the sheet, right? The med pack. So the med pack is one of the items on the sheet of paper, and so he's pointing towards it before retrieving the word. So it's a deictic gesture. Again, by pointing, I don't necessarily mean index finger, right? It can also be a whole hand. And you can point with your head as well, or with your foot. So it can be done with various parts of your body. And then the last one is an interesting example of, you see, she's tapping against the table in repetitive motions. And that's a typical example of a thinking gesture, where she's kind of trying to think of the word. And so you see, it's not related to speech content because it doesn't represent anything and it's not used to refer to something on the sheet of paper, but it really embodies the process of thinking with this repetitive tapping movement. So yes, these are some examples of gestures. The examples I gave are very short, focusing on a gesture itself, but it's also important to consider gestures as part of interaction. And so now I'm going to give more examples between peer interaction. So here, moving on to another corpus. So this time, these are Cantonese speakers, learners of English. And so initially in the project, they were recorded face-to-face and online on Zoom, but I'm only going to show the interactions face-to-face. So just like before, I mean, there's a bar in between, but they're in the same room. They're just two cameras. And so here, as you will see, it's a majority of, it's mostly in referential gestures, but it's important to see them as part of their sequentiality. I mean, these gestures are not produced in isolation. They're not produced out of the blue. They're really co-produced and they lead to co-construction as well. And so that's why it's really important to consider them not as individual features, but also interactive ones. And so I'll show you the clip here. Just a bit of context. They're discussing the effect of the waves, and so they talk about what happens, right? When there's some sort of a tsunami and with the trees, and so they're discussing this. Okay.
It would be more easy to have more likely to contain.
The wave is just going without any obscure and it
no barrier, then they come very quickly.
Yeah, they come fast and they come angry. But with some plant, like I don't know, maybe some palm tree, they can stop them a little bit, and the roots under the ground can also grab the sand more tightly, so that they won't.
Right, so a lot of things happening here. And so you see that it's a lot about negotiating meaning. So they're talking about the waves and what happens with the waves to the trees, etc. And this happens through speech and gesture. And it's a lot of gesture repetitions as well. So I'll just walk you through step by step. So first of all, what happens is that the first speaker, he initiates a representational gesture to refer to the wave, right? That the fact that the wave is going straight on, right? Because in places when there are no trees, so that's the thing, when there's like waves by the sea, but there's no trees, then the waves will go, that's what he means, without any obscures, I'm guessing without any trees or anything that could prevent the wave from crashing down. And so you see, it uses his left hand, it's kind of a slow pace, kind of a long gesture, and it's pretty large, right? If I play it again, you can see it right there.
the wave is just going without any obscure.
Right, you see kind of a slow movement representing the wave coming crashing down in kind of a slow motion, and so that really represents the action is associated with the wave. And then what happens is that speaker two kind of picks up on that and says, yeah, no barrier, then it will come very quickly. And so he initiates another referential gesture, but this time a much smaller one in the center of this gesture space and faster. And it goes again with the idea of they will come not just without any obscures, according to speaker one, but also very quickly. And this is also epitomized in the gesture he produces.
No better than they will come very quickly.
And then after that, that's when speaker one picks up on this gesture and he repeats a similar one, right? With the open palm facing down with a slightly slower pace, using a large gesture as well. So still using his own pace, but retaining some of the parameters that were used by speaker two.
They come fast and they come angry.
And so you see how it's not just about repeating gestures, it's also about co-constructing speech together. Because what happens is that first, right, so speaker one goes and says, well, the root under the ground can also, and then he's interrupted by speaker two, who kind of offers what we call an embodied completion. So it's the completion of speech and gesture, right? So completing the idea of the root can also grab, and so you see again this representational gesture associated with the action of grabbing, and then he repeats grabbing both in his speech and his gesture more tightly. So you see again this idea of tight is expressed in a gesture, and then absorb some water. So here the gesture is repeated. This notion of tightness is repeated, although not speech, because he just says absorb some water. Although maybe this also relates to this idea of being tight. And so you see how, first of all, these gesture repetitions were used with formal variations in size, shape, and pace, but also accompanied by lexical development. So elaborating on the processes, adding adjectives, changing the verbs, and adding some elements to kind of complete what the other people are saying. And so you see how it really is in this context of co-construction with these embodied completions where talk and gestures are negotiated. So again, it's not just about producing a gesture on your own, it's also about co-producing them and how it leads to co-construction and mutual understanding. So it really is important, in my opinion, to consider L2 learning and speaking not as an individual process, but practiced in interaction. And so there's a variety of multimodal interaction settings. I mean, I mentioned the L1, L2 tandem interactions. So with the alternating roles between the L1 expert speaker and the L2 beginner, let's say, or not as proficient speaker, where the roles are reversed. So it really increases this level of mutual friendliness and solidarity. So it really is a great context, right, for learning. And then you also have peer, usually what we mean by peer interactions, meaning interactions between L2 speakers, L2, L2. So it can be L2 speakers from the same L1, that's the case here, with Cantonese speakers, but you can also speak in your L2 with someone else whose L1 is not the same as you. And so we think of, usually English is known as the lingua franca, the language that is spoken mostly for mutual understanding across several L1 speakers. And then you also have L2 peer interactions, but are task-based. So usually used for the studies in L2 when you want a degree of control when you compare L1 and L2. And so here around a task, so a game or a map task, so all of these are also used for in more experimental purposes. But not to mention, you also have classroom interactions, family interactions, friends interactions. I mean, there are lots of different interaction settings, but still, I think it really is important to consider that L2 learning is not just done in isolation, but with other people in interaction, whether it's a dyad or more than two people. Okay. And so very quickly, what do scientific studies show? Because there's lots of work on gestures and multimodality in second language acquisition. There's this one book that came out recently, although there are others now. So more and more, there really is a growing interest in the study of gestures in SLA. Generally speaking, studies show that gestures support cognitive, communicative, and social dimensions of language learning. They're also seen as a window into the mind of the speakers, of the learners. So, the thinking gesture I was showing before is kind of an open window into the cognitive processes associated with thinking, for example, or lexical retrieval and all these elements. And studies have also shown that gesture rates vary with proficiency. So usually less proficient speakers tend to produce more gestures in their L2 than in their L1, but there are also differences in the type of gestures. So for example, some studies have shown that the more proficient you become, the more likely you are to produce pragmatic gestures, for example. So these are differences as well with proficiency. And in the data that I showed from the Finnish speakers, they're highly proficient. And so we didn't find many differences between L1 and L2, except for frequency, but not in terms of type. So you see, it really depends as well on the level of proficiency. But overall, they're shown to serve an effective role in problem solving, repair, comprehension, phoneme, and vocabulary acquisition. And in professional presentations, more generally speaking, they can also help create content and engage with the audience. So there's also lots of studies on pedagogical gestures and gestures produced by instructors, but so that will not be the topic of this talk, but there's also this field that are looking at teachers and pedagogical gestures. And so it's also very interesting, and it is also very helpful for learners and learning. And so I'd just like to look at this about how gestures could help in phoneme and vocabulary acquisition. I mean, there's some experimental studies with participants looking at stimuli in different conditions. So with or without audio, with a gesture, without a gesture, and they've shown to be quite effective. But even outside of experimental settings, it's something you can observe in conversation as well. And so I'd just like to show another example of how gestures can be beneficial for vocabulary and phoneme acquisition. This is an example from a tandem interaction. It's the same pair that you saw at the very beginning with the French girl on the left, the American guy on the right. French girl on the left, American guy on the right. So I confused my left and right. So, and here, she's still talking about the house that is by the hills, but this time she's talking about the animals that live near the house. And so you will see there's also some mispronunciations in there.
Snow in the car.
Oh,
in the beautiful Ferrari with.
No, sorry, it's another example. Actually, sorry. I was confusing with another example. No. In this one, she's talking about a car, and there's a lot of snow in a Ferrari car. Sorry about that. I was confusing with another example, but yeah, that's. I'll play it again.
Snow in the car.
Oh,
in the beautiful Ferrari with.
Oh no.
With the enter in leather.
And the leather so switch those words. Leather interior.
Yeah.
Not
yeah,
interior
because
leather.
Yes, in Ferrari you have leather and.
Yeah. It's just what you said. It's just switch the words. Okay. So it's leather interior, not interior leather.
Leather interior.
Yeah, there you go.
Leather interior.
Yeah.
So there's snow everywhere.
Oh no.
And
yeah, so I'm sorry, I just realized that I picked the wrong excerpt I wanted to show up. So this is interesting because of the word order, so syntax with leather interior, interior leather. So you may notice he does this switching gesture. But I wanted to show another one actually, which I don't have here, I'm sorry. So just to give you a bit of context, it's about the pronunciation of goose and the plural form geese. And so she says goose, but she meant geese. And so he explains how the plural form is actually geese with EE. And so sorry, I didn't have a video there, but I can show you some screenshots where, so you see he explains, the L1 speaker explains the plural form of goose. And so he does this kind of similar to the switching hand gesture you saw, but this gesture of like switching from one goose, right? There's more than one goose. They're geese. So he does this kind of switching hand gesture to explain the plural form of goose. And then the L2 speaker repeats the word geese and hyper-articulate, right? Really using all of her, right, extending her mouth for the vowel, right, like geese, so from goose to geese. And then you see it uses graphophonology there and writes the vowel cluster EE in the air to really focus on the relationship between spelling and pronunciation. And so you see, you write the vowel cluster in the air, that's a representational gesture, EE, and then she actually repeats the EE gesture and repeat the word as well, geese. So yes. So I'm guessing with the images it's pretty straightforward, but yes, it was not the right video that I wanted to show. But the other one was also interesting. But so in any case, in both examples, you can really see how the L2 speaker, who's not a teacher, right? It's not his role to be so pedagogical, but he is kind of, yeah, embodying this figure of a teacher-like figure, and he does that through gestures. So either right, talking about word order with the switching or graphophonology, right, with the EE and relationship between speech and spelling and speech and pronunciation, sorry. And so you see how these gestures are not just about common understanding, but can really be beneficial as well. At least at this moment, we don't know if she may forget, right, and later on forget that it's geese instead of goose, but at least in that moment, because that's what you do when you look at interactions, you look moment by moment what's happening. And you can see how you shift from a just mutual form of understanding to a more pedagogical oriented sequence where the focus is really on the pronunciation of the word or vocabulary. So that was an example there. Okay. And now, if you think of proficiency, because it's something we're interested in, when you think about second language learning, second language acquisition, you think, okay, we need, if you have students, I mean, I work in the English department, and so my students have to speak in English, in phonetics, and linguistics, and you have to evaluate their degree of proficiency, right? And how do you do that? And so there are lots of ways, I mean, there's lots of ways, as you know, but one example I'm going to give with very, very basic examples, just to give you the different levels, is a model based on 3 dimensions. And so if you look at the following, it's very clear to see which utterances are correct, but for different reasons. So you see in the first example, right, if you compare I like cats, they're cute, they're independent, compared to saying I like cats because they're lovely, independent animals, which don't require constant attention. If I say she go to the store yesterday or she went to the store yesterday, and then if I say I like reading books and I like reading books, right? I think each time it was very clear that the correct, again, from this kind of uh, instructor's point of view, if you were to evaluate, right, the proficiency of these utterances, you know the correct way would be the ones in green, but for different reasons. And on the one hand, in the first case, it's not so much that it's ungrammatical, right? The I like cats, they're cute, they're independent. It's not ungrammatical, but it's just that it lacks complexity. And so that's one dimension of proficiency, is complexity. If you look at the second example, it's just wrong. I mean, from a grammatical point of view, it's just not the correct tense, it's not the correct form, so it's just not accurate. So that's the notion of accuracy. And then in the end, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just lots of pauses and hesitations. So it's not very fluid. And so we talk about fluency. And so these 3 dimensions have been understood in terms of this CAF model. So complexity, accuracy, fluency. So it's kind of an old model now. I mean, obviously there are lots of more ways to, many ways now to look at second language proficiency, but it's just to give you an example very quickly. And so complexity is the use of complex sentences, lexical and grammatical words, accuracy, correct grammar, pronunciation, and then fluency with the flow and speed and minimal use of hesitations in speech. But so if we stop for a minute and look at this use of hesitations, I mean, that matters to me because as I was presented, I mean, I did my my PhD on fluency and disfluency, and I spent the whole time deconstructing this idea of what is fluent, what is disfluent, and how could this account as proficiency, etc. But so actually, when you look at gestures, it's not just about these 3 dimensions. There's a lot about what happens with your body as well. And so when you think of these hesitations, well, of course, you got to use minimal hesitations for common understanding, but you can also have gestures that can be produced during hesitations. And so these hesitations are not just negative non-lexical elements, they can also become rich elements thanks to the gestures that accompany them. And so, yeah, I'd like to finish with these two examples again of what happens when you have gestures during hesitations, and again, how it may reinforce learning and mutual understanding. Same pair again, but this time in the two settings, in French and in English, so where the roles are reversed.
Oui, t'as des hauts et des bas, les gens deviennent gentils, deviennent méchants.
Right, I'll just a bit of context. In the first video, he's talking about adolescence, teenage years, and how, right, as a teenager, you're kind of fickle and things, and that's when he does this waving movement, up and down kind of movement. I'll play it again.
Oui, t'as des hauts et des bas, les gens deviennent gentils, deviennent méchants.
Right, and then in L1, L2 English, she's talking about social media and Twitter.
They are more on the Twitter and Facebook than with all the real people that just wait a minute, I'm writing on Twitter, okay.
They're like missing the real moment.
Right, so you see each time you have referential gestures, so the Twitter kind of typing on your phone gesture, and then the up and down kind of wave and metaphorical gesture. And so you see what's happening here is that each time they're happening, they're initiated during the hesitations, right? There's a lengthening before Twitter, and then a pause. And then in the other one, it's also a lengthening and a pause. So you see kind of similar hesitation markers as well, lengthening and a pause. But so while from a vocal perspective, you would say, okay, there's nothing happening here. It's just a lengthening and a pause. But if you look at gestures, that's when the referential gesture is initiated. And so you see, it's the hesitations paved the way for the gestures. They kind of gave room, they gave space for the gestures. And then we have the lexical affiliate, Twitter, or ups and downs. And so you see, they really happen in this interactive and intersubjective context, when you have tokens of agreement, head nods, and a gesture repeated. Because you see the gestures initiated by the L2 speakers were also repeated by the L1 speakers, again, to reinforce mutual understanding. So it's not just about producing hesitations, it's about how you produce them, and if they happen to co-occur with gestures, it's not so much disfluent anymore, but rather fluent. That's a different story. That's my PhD, so I'm not going to talk too long about this because it's going to take hours. But yeah, so that's the main idea here. And so little by little, when you also look at gestures, you shift from these individual proficiency measures to this notion of interactional competence. And so interactional competence is the ability not just to produce correct grammar and syntax and pronunciation, etc. It's the ability to manage conversations smoothly. And that includes turn taking, repair mechanisms, and managing the flow of interaction. So showing your degree of engagement, providing feedback when prompted or when it's relevant. And so all of these are also levels of competence. It's not just individual linguistic skills, it's also interactional skills. And so through verbal and visual gestural resources, they can be used to co-construct meaning, display stance, and maintain engagement. And so it's not just about using gestures because we don't have the words in our L2. We usually have this simplistic vision of gestures are compensatory, as if, we don't have the words, so we just use gestures. Although sometimes it can be that, of course, with less proficient speakers, but it's also this coordination where they go together. When speech is missing, there's a gesture, and speech may be there, but the gesture comes, and it's just, again, it's about coordinating these modalities rather than thinking, oh, one way, well, one is at this level and the other one at the other level. So the take-home message. So L2 proficiency, and again, I gave a very basic and introductive view of L2 proficiency. There are lots of studies on L2 proficiency, so that wasn't the aim here today, but it's just the idea is that it's not just an individual verbal process, but a multimodal interactional one. L2 learning is done through social interactions where you have a variety of settings and what we mean by social interaction, it also means in daily activities, not just in a classroom or the example that I provided were still pretty restricted because they're recorded, of course, but it also means, going to the supermarket or at a bar or at dinner. So you see, it's not just about dyadic conversations in a classroom. It can really include any form of social interaction. And so gestures are not just there. They really are a really important and fundamental part of language learning. And so as studies have shown, they support cognitive and social dimension of language learning, and they have an effective role in problem solving, repair, comprehension, phoneme and vocabulary acquisitions, fluency, etc., among other processes. Right, so thank you very much for listening. If you want more examples, more references, you can go to my website or on ResearchGate. And I also like to thank my collaborators, without whom it would be impossible to work on these really interesting data. So with Céline Hogg and Sylvia Scheuer from Sorbonne Nouvelle University, thanks to whom I have access to the tandem interactions. Pauliina Peltonen from the University of Turku in Finland, thanks to whom I have the interesting, the nice Finnish data I showed you, and then Renia Lopez-Ociaplo from Hong Kong for the Cantonese learners of English. So thank you very much.